All right, it's a little quieter now. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I'm Lauren Lehman, and I am with ATIS. This is our first go as a strategic affiliate here at this mHealth Summit, and we're really delighted to be here. I stepped into the keynote that was going on earlier this morning, and right when I walked in, somebody was saying, mobile technology is more than just looking up data. And we happen to agree completely, and I think that fits nicely into the presentation that we're going to do today. For those of you that don't know, ATIS is an association. We're based in D.C. We focus on technology and standards development, and our members include companies from all parts of the ICT or technology ecosystem. So service providers like AT&T and Verizon and Sprint, as well as suppliers such as the two that we have today, Hitachi and Cisco, as well as a variety of smaller companies as well. And with me today, I'm really pleased. We have two speakers that I think you're really going to find fascinating. From Cisco, Bela Sander is the director of the Healthcare Cloud Business Unit, and he's going to talk about kind of the cloud ecosystem, and more. And he's going to be followed by Dave Foote, who is the Chief Technical Officer of Hitachi Communication Technologies Americas. And Dave, who has long been an active and very valuable board member to ATIS, is also the Vice Chair of the One M2M Steering Committee. And Dave's going to talk a little bit about how ATIS has become involved with M2M and the verticals such as eHealth and what the One M2M global organization is working to accomplish. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Bela. And if you could, we're happy to take questions, but let's try to consolidate all those at the end.
Thank you for that. Good morning, everybody. Bela Sander. So I just wanted to cover a little bit, talk a little bit about the cloud, some of the trends, some of the industry trends, some of the insights and themes that we're seeing out in the field, and talk a little bit about some of the models of success. I'm going to be very high level and general with my statements, and then David will fill out some of the M2M details for us. So how have intranets evolved as we've gone along? You know, early on in the late 90s, intranets in whatever environment that they are, in enterprise environment, healthcare environment, they were more about, communication centric, right? It was about email. It was about communicating things out into the enterprise. And as we started moving along, the next step in our evolution started, we started talking about being more self-service centric. So it was start taking care of things for yourself on the net, right? And we saw this not only in intranets, but we also saw this in the way that enterprises dealt with their customers. Typical example is, your cable TV. I want to add HBO. I don't call a call center anymore. I get onto their cloud service. Now we're starting to really move into a collaboration-centric view of the cloud. And what I mean by that, very typical, how many of you have seen very often when you're interfacing with a company's website, there's a push to chat, a push to video nowadays where you just click on it and they'll call you back. So it's really starting to be more about how do I collaborate? And we're starting to see a lot of enterprises, and we're starting to see a lot of healthcare enterprises as well starting to see their intranets as a place to collaborate, not just a communications medium. And really the next stage is the information workplace. Right? And we're seeing a lot of industries, including healthcare, move very quickly into this. And it's really bringing all of that together, all of the past together. How do we bring our our content and our applications into a single portal and collaborate so that it becomes the enabler of our collaboration. It becomes the enabler of the way we do work. And this shows it as well, right? So in what we call Web 2.0, right? Where are we moving? We're moving to capturing and sharing of knowledge and corporate communications and managing projects. This isn't about email anymore. This isn't about just making announcements on the web anymore. This is really becoming about sharing and capturing knowledge, right? Regardless of what industry that we're talking about. And there's a few complications, in this conversation. Our employees have changed. When IT organizations think about how they push IT out into the company, or healthcare organizations push IT out into a hospital environment, the doctors are now saying, hey, I've got an iPad. I want to use my iPad. I don't want to use your Windows device that you're telling me to use. How do I do that? And the customers have changed, and the patients have changed. They now want customized experience. They say they want privacy, and that's paramount, and that's very important, especially in our world of HIPAA. But at the same time, when they are interfacing with the enterprise, when they're interfacing with the healthcare provider, they want a much more personalized experience. And the business is distributed, and this is especially true for healthcare, right? The docs that are sitting in their offices, they're holding onto their EMR data. PACS images are everywhere. The business itself and the collaboration now has to be more distributed, and how do we do that is one of the big challenges that we're trying to work through these days. And again, our customers, they want to be taken care of. Our employees want to be taken care of. Our partners want to be taken care of wherever they are on whatever device they are. And when I say on whatever device they are, I don't only mean consuming devices. Like an iPad, I'm consuming services. I'm consuming healthcare. I also mean telemetry devices, any devices that are providing data into the cloud. Sensors, telemetry devices, that type of thing. Anytime, any location, any device is the new paradigm. And mobility is the big game changer now. What we're seeing, and we've done a lot of research with our partners on this, and I think that the top number is low. There's planned to be 7.5 billion Wi-Fi enabled devices in the world by 2015. I think with the advent of smartphones and tablets, that number is going to be much higher than that. Smartphone acceptance is growing at 50% plus annually. I just look in this country alone in the past 2 years, everyone went from having the Nokia or the Motorola handset to having that smartphone. And we're seeing this globally now. So we're seeing a fundamental shift in every part of the world to smart technology now, not the old Nokia or the Motorola handset that can send texts and get phone calls today. Okay? And mobile data is also moving, and it's moving to Wi-Fi. We're seeing a huge shift away from other sources of data, whether it's wired mobility or whether it's mobility off 3G or 4G to Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is going to make a fundamental shift as we move forward. And it's really interesting is this year, 50%. It's projected that 50% of the mobile devices that will ship, and again, because of tablets and smartphones, I wouldn't be surprised if that's a much higher number, will ship without even a wired port. We look just the MacBook Air. It doesn't have an Ethernet port. It only has Wi-Fi. So mobility is changing everything. So what does that bring us? That brings us what we start thinking of. This is where we start thinking of the borderless world. All right? There's nothing to plug into anymore. You know, the concept of a firewall becomes challenging because how do you create that user experience when there's a firewall in between? And the users are really changing their expectations these days. They're looking for tailored experiences. You know, and this is a real challenge in our world, isn't it? You know, with privacy concerns. You know, how do you tailor an experience yet manage privacy? And that also, security is becoming paramount. It's become a very key issue. But again, in the healthcare, it's not only just about security, but it's also about privacy as well, isn't it? You know, and those are big concerns. And the users are looking for apps to be delivered when they want them. And they want to talk to people when they need to talk to people. They don't want to talk to people when they don't want to talk to people, but they want the interface, the information, when they want it, where they want it, on whatever device they want it on. All right? And that brings us to our last point as well. They want to be confident in their devices. They want to know that they work. They want to know that devices that are feeding information into the cloud, whether, again, it's telemetry devices, sensors, things like that, they could be confident in that data. So really, what we have is we paint a broad picture that we really need to think about when we think about all of this collaboration and data and clouds and all that. You know, we need to start with considering the end users. You know, gone are the days where we created something and they will come. We have to start thinking with the end users in mind first. You know, and we know, for example, that Apple and Google and these guys have done a very good job at that because they take a users-in approach. You know, and let's not forget, this is not only about docs and nurses. This is also about technicians. This is also about the patients, the parents, the families, and things like first responders. You know, how do first responders come into the whole picture? I mean, we've seen customers out there in mining and farming areas that are able to throw on a helicopter an entire first stage surgical unit and stick it out in the field. Well, that's all great, but how does that communicate back to the hospital system? Endpoints, everybody wants everything, and what's missing from this screen are those telemetry devices. The telemetry devices, it's no longer about, hey, this is what I'm going to give you, this is the data that I'm going to give you, use it. Now telemetry devices have to be smarter. And of course we need to think about infrastructure and the applications. A lot of the applications in healthcare today are not cloud ready. How do we cloud enable? How do we take them out to the edge? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And here's another big game changer, social networks. And I'm not talking about Facebook here. I am, but I'm not. I'm also talking about business class social networks. We're seeing the intranet change from just a static portal to a social network, to an enterprise-grade Facebook. How do you move that water cooler conversation that, maybe two physicians have in a hospital, and how do you move it online so that once you get it past the water cooler, it still has relevance? So we're really seeing that. But what we're also seeing is sites like this, Patients Like Me, for example, where people are putting their experiences in to social media sites, and they're sharing their experiences. And once they start doing that, they start learning from each other. I mean, think about it, WebMD. You go to the doctor gives you a diagnosis, first thing you do is you go home and you look at mayoclinic.com or webmd.com. The patients are getting a lot more savvy. And this is a game changer, but this is also something that, if captured correctly, for example, crowdsourcing, if you've already got all that data in Patients Like Me, how do you then run analytics on that data to say, hey, maybe we can do some evidence-based medicine in real time here instead of just on data that's come out of, payer data and things like that. And if all this wasn't complicated enough, we've got the other issue, especially in healthcare, of distributed data. So we may have clinical data, we may have payer data, even marketing data, PACS images spread across radiology groups, spread across geographic locations. How do we bring that, how do we federate that data? How do we bring it together and act on it as if it were a single repository of data? You know, and we need to start thinking about intelligent routing engines. You know, some of this is HIE, some of this is, you know, HL7 and things like that. But also some of it's federating of data and how do we sync data and all that kind of things. So 5 inevitable realities. Healthcare is becoming borderless. You know, it's being driven by reform, it's being driven by technology, but it's becoming borderless and it's becoming collaborative. The patient experience will matter. You know, patients are you know, if they're not going to get valid information from their physicians that they feel comfortable with, they're going to go out on the web and they're going to get it however they want to. You know, they're looking for experiences, they're looking for information, they're looking for a certain amount of being able to manage their own health care. And of course, point 3 we all know, right? Payment will be linked to value, and that's not just here in the U.S. with reform, but this is the way it's going on everywhere. Life science, we're seeing that a lot in Europe, where it's now, you know, pay for performance, not pay per pill models, and things like that are being considered by NICE in England, for example. Social care will blend with health care. I think that's self-evident. And enterprises will need to focus on sustainability. Sustainability is not a fad. It's not going away. It's real, and we need to consider it. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, that journey that we've taken to cloud. You know, it used to be that everything was in application-based silos. You had an app, it sat on a server, you had some network in between, and you had some storage. Maybe you had some shared storage, you know, some kind of a, you know, storage area network or something. Then we started moving to zones of virtualization. So you had an area, you had a single set of servers that were virtualized. We had, you know, 9 or 10 apps sitting on them, and then we had some shared storage, right? But you still had zones of virtualization. Maybe you had, you know, mission-critical data kept in one zone, and maybe you had marketing somewhere else, and, you know, what have you. But now we're moving into this whole world of cloud, private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, community cloud. It's, you know, and again, cloud is 2 things. Cloud is an architecture. We'll talk a little bit about the architecture of cloud, but it's also a business model, right? And if we think about that, if we think about how we consume and provide services on the cloud, and think of that as a business model, you know, then our job becomes more comprehensible, right? So here's the standard NIST definition of cloud. You know, these are the same guys that are working on a lot of the meaningful use stuff. Model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, and on-demand network access. So that's the first thing. We're accessing resources on the network in an easy way that's there when we need it, how we need it, why we need it. And in this definition, it's a shared pool of configurable computing resources. Right? So it can be, you know, as simple as infrastructure, networks, storage, servers, that kind of thing. But it can also be applications and services. Right? So Salesforce.com, probably one of the most famous of the cloud applications. It's out there on the public cloud, you know, and I consume it, the amount of it I want or the amount of it that I don't want, right? And that it can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. And this is the other key differentiator of the cloud, is that it is about self-service, right? So you can't have an effective cloud story where to get access to any resource, someone's got to call someone, right? It's a self-service story. But let's look at that a little bit more carefully. The deployment models that most people think about are the public, private, and hybrid. So public, that's pretty easy, right? So again, Salesforce.com or some of these other Google Docs, some of these other applications. So there's public services out on the public cloud that I can consume. Maybe I pay for them. Maybe there's some kind of advertising-led funding model, right? Private cloud. Take the cloud architecture concept, the cloud business model, and apply it within our own firewalls, all right, within our own enterprise. A hospital may look at the cloud model as a way for delivering services within the hospital. Hybrid, which is really where the focus is these days, is that, well, let me think about both. So I've got some applications sitting here in my data center that I'm supplying to my user base, whether it's within the hospital, physicians, whether it's patient care at home, what have you. But also there are some really good, really effective applications. Maybe there's some EMR out there that I could pull off the cloud and offer it to my user base, right? So it's a combination of both. I'm offering services from my own data center, but I'm also offering my users services from the cloud. And we see this a lot in enterprises these days, right? So a lot of enterprises will have their own internal intranets and everything else, but for CRM they're using Salesforce.com. Typical example. But what's really getting interesting in healthcare is the concept of the community cloud. And the community cloud is, I'm going to offer services, don't really care where I get them from. Maybe I get them off the public cloud. Maybe maybe it's a hybrid model. But I'm only offering it to a closed subset of users that have some kind of community interest. And I think the best example for this is what we're seeing a lot of healthcare providers do in the ACO world. So the ACO can be thought of as a community cloud in that maybe I'm a hospital, maybe I've got a data center, maybe I'm part of some ACO that's forming, and I want to offer my services out of my data center to the docs and anybody else that's involved in the ACO in which I am, right? So what they want to do is they need to reach beyond their firewalls, offer services beyond their firewalls, but not on the public cloud. They need to restrict it to within that ACO community, for example. So that's a great example of a community cloud. And it's a model that's growing very quickly. The three service models is kind of, we called it the three layers of cloud. Infrastructure as a service, where we offer compute, network storage, virtualization as a service. Amazon is a typical example here. I need to buy some server space. I go to Amazon, I buy some server space. And it's dynamic. I consume as much as I want or as little as I want. Platform as a service is that middle layer. All of the platform things, OS, database, access, portal rendering engines, whatever you need to enable your applications to run. Again, we're seeing service providers offering platform as a service that you can consume. I can consume as much database as I want or as little as I need. And then software as a service, and that's the applications itself. That's the Salesforce.coms of the world. That's the, maybe some type of an open EMR or something that you're serving as a service. In the healthcare space, with a few exceptions, it's really the focus is on that software as a service. So we're seeing, hospitals starting to think of themselves as healthcare service providers, and they want to offer services on the cloud. So they need the infrastructure and the platform in their data center to build it, but then on top of that, they're building their services and offering them as a cloud. A key piece of that software as a service layer is that all the collaboration tools, because again, remember we talked about that collaboration is starting to become a key component to the cloud model, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Let me just touch briefly on some of the characteristics of cloud that we talked about. Again, ease of integrating new customers and partners. you need to be able to, you need to, it's got to be self-service, you need to make it easy, otherwise it becomes a cost nightmare. Because if someone has to make a phone call to someone to get an application provisioned or compute space division or what have you, that's going to eat tremendously into your cost. And rapid elasticity, I think that's pretty self-evident. You need to be able to turn up and turn down and be very efficient, both as a provider of services as well as a consumer of services, being very efficient on your use of resources. Metering, key, very key, both to service level agreements as well as to things like charging or chargeback. You need to be able to meter for your services. Again, we talked about self-service and resource pooling. While we talked about the benefits of cloud, cost savings, business agility, any device, being able to share information across boundaries, there are a few concerns, and these are key. Operational insertion in healthcare is one of the key concern areas that one must think about, right? How do you insert a new application or a new clinical workflow or a new application into a clinical workflow without upsetting that clinical workflow, especially when you're talking about more high demand areas? How do you, for example, introduce a new application into an ER's clinical workflow without the ER suffering significant problems? Security, trust, privacy, absolute key. Acquisition, how do we acquire data? How do we do that securely? How do we do that within HIPAA guidelines when that data is all over the place? How do we want to offer a patient experience that brings together all those data from different sources? Because that's what the patient wants to see, but how do you do that within the privacy environment that we have? And data portability. This is the whole thing that the HIEs grapple with, HL7 and all this thing. How do you move data around, right, that may come from different sources, may have different formats? So things to be concerned about in the cloud. So in our space, what are we seeing? This is just, I'm only talking here about the clinical services. Obviously, a lot of us are using CRMs that are out on the cloud, or we're offering intranets and things like that are on the cloud. But what are the clinical applications? The two big ones, EMR and PACS. Makes perfect sense. If I'm a hospital and I've got an ecosystem of docs, maybe I'm part of a coming ACO or something, I want to offer EMR services. Also, a lot of these public cloud-based EMR services, and PACS is another one. Right, so how do I offer access to referring physicians into PACS systems, especially when I may have 10 or 12 different radiology centers, and maybe there's a hospital involved as well with the radiology center, and I really don't know where my patient went, and I really don't care as a referring physician. I want a single sign-on into a system and be able to pull those images if I want, or if I don't even care about images, I just want to see the radiology reports. The other two growing areas that are growing very fast is telehealth, care at a distance, especially now that we're in the world of worrying about things like readmissions and that type of thing, pushing care to the home, and telehealth is becoming a key issue. And we're seeing it. We're seeing, the Walmarts of the world saying, how do I put clinics into each one of my stores without actually having a physician present? Things like that. And clinical trials and clinical research are becoming another big area. Because, again, we have issues there with lots of data. We have the pharmaceutical research companies are now starting to say, hey, we don't want to keep all the research in-house. We're now going into the CRO, the contracted research organization model. Well, how do we bring all those partners together to collaborate share data and control how they share the data and control who gets access to what data. And maybe those partners also want to control who gets access to what data. You know? So you're seeing, you know, the sharing of collaboration, the sharing of applications, and the sharing of data becoming you know, a big, growing service area for cloud. Really, to get maximum effectiveness out of any type of collaborative cloud model, you really want to focus on a couple things. You know, first of all, you have to have, it has to be a leadership-driven model. You need, from top down, focus on collaboration. You need to have a commitment to these models, to collaboration, in order to get maximum value out of it. But the other big thing is that you also need, your employees need, or your users need, or the physicians need, or whoever they are, have to have a competency to collaborate. It's one thing to stick the tools out there, but it's another thing to either make them easy enough to where you don't have to think about it, or that you have the right level of training to really get the maximum value out of it. Technologies is also key, but the big, in my mind, the big block there is governance. Any time that we talk about cloud or collaboration or anything like that, governance is key. How do you drive behavior? How do you control access to data? You know, what are the rules around that? You know, the typical example here, it's great to have telehealth, and it's great to say, you know, this physician can have access to a piece of data and that one doesn't. But if they're both talking to each other on a high definition you know, telepresence conference, and one guy's looking at data on his iPad and says, here, see, look, you know, well, suddenly you might have broken some pretty big HIPAA rules there. So, you know, and the technology is not going to solve that problem. You know, strong governance is where you deal with that problem. So, getting near to the end here, but this is kind of the crux of the whole thing is, you know, what is that model and what's that road from an architecture perspective to cloud and collaborative cloud, right? Obviously, it starts with the network. Secure, reliable, scalable, virtualized network. Network is the platform that everything runs on. And then on top of that, all of your collaborative cloud applications. Okay? So let's start with the typical existing. I think every data center that I know has got, you know, these few things. You know, everybody's got email, calendaring, you know, security management, transport, storage, computing, basic systems data, things like that. To move into a collaborative, cloud-based application delivery, you know, these are kind of the minimum strategic foundation that you really need. You know, real-time communications, mobility, virtualization, presence, and then some farther communications. And by the way, a lot of people have probably already delivered this. But these are the low-hanging fruit. These are the quick wins. Okay, so you know, in types of instant messaging, Twittering, even we're seeing, you know, an awful lot of that. But really, that conferencing, that's where the real collaboration starts. The immersive conferencing, whether it's doc to doc, whether it's, you know, physician to the home, physician to the specialist. Okay, and then we're also seeing, you know, large moves to all kinds of informing wikis and podcasts and those types of things. And then, you know, these are the real advanced capabilities. The two that I would really want to point out in the screen are certainly analytics, you know, and how do we think about analytics in a distributed environment? You know, how do you run analytics on data that's all over the place? Okay, so keep it, and composite applications. And this is really where the rubber is going to hit the road as we move forward. The concept of service exchange. And so when I talk about service exchange, what I'm talking about here is I've got services, we talked about this earlier, right? I've got services in my data center. I can get services off the public cloud. Maybe I've got some kind of a federated cloud of clouds, so I've got partners that also have clouds, and they've got some pretty great services. And on the simplest level, let me bring all those services together and stick them all in a single portal that I put in front of my users, whoever those users are. But then it really becomes interesting when I start commingling those things. So I may have an EMR service or an EMR application in my data center. And maybe I want to work with the radiology group who's got a great cloud-based PACS system that's bringing together all of the imaging, as well as maybe they've got a really nice radiology imaging system, right? And I could bring all those together and stick them into a single portal using cloud technology and cloud business model. But what if I suddenly started commingling them, putting them all into a single application? Or what gets really interesting is, what if I start orchestrating? What if I start taking all those applications and binding them together and then weaving in collaboration tools and start creating clinical workflows, business process as a service? And that's what I'm offering up. And that's where the rubber hits the road, because now I'm taking not only what's in my data center and not only what's in my partner's data center, but maybe I'm even taking something on the public cloud, and I'm bringing it all together into a single clinical workflow or a business process. And that's really what makes a difference. And that's when we start talking about home health care, and we start talking about collaboration, among the whole, healthcare continuum. And then we start thinking about, medical home, patient-centered medical home and things like that, then this kind of clinical workflow starts being interesting. So with that, thank you very much. That's my details. If anybody's interested, I'll turn over to David now, who will get a little bit more into the details.
Great. Thanks, Bella. All right, so I was already introduced. Thanks a lot, Lauren. Just a little bit about Hitachi, really big company, over $100 billion in revenue. So, how are we interested in the medical community? Well, a number of ways. Maybe many of you are very familiar with Hitachi from the imaging and diagnostics point of view. Hitachi makes MRIs, CAT scanners, a lot of imaging and diagnostics technology. I actually represent the information and telecom systems part, the ICT part of Hitachi, kind of similar to Bela in the ICT industry. And we're all about pulling that data from sensors and telemetry, like the connected home with home health care, et cetera, the networks and the ICT solutions that would potentially take that imaging data and bring it into the cloud so it can be used by the different players. So just one of the interesting things we see is this whole idea of machine-to-machine that Bela talked about, and we see that moving into the home, for example. We talked about, and you've seen forecasts that in the next few years there's something like 5 billion users that have smartphones and tablets connected to mobile networks. You may not be aware that in that same time frame, forecasts are, and these are fairly widely variable, but some of the forecasts are that there will be 50 billion connected devices, 10 times more than smartphones and tablets. And those will be things like medical sensors in a home. It will be things like a GPS and 3G radio on a farm tractor that gives real-time data on spreading fertilizer while the farmer is driving his tractor. Every industry around the world, healthcare, industrial, transportation, power utilities, smart grid, are looking at deploying devices and sensors to create real-time environments. So we're going to have an environment soon where what consumers are interact with the internet through smartphones and tablets and PCs is the minority of what's going on over the internet. The majority of it will be devices that humans don't touch, devices that pull this data from the home or from a clinic, send it into the cloud that Bela was referring to, and now we have this environment of how do I secure all that, how do I coalesce that data, then how do I redistribute it? So that's one of our big areas of interest. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the cloud and the security and aspects of that and securing that. So we see that e-health applications and services require a unique trust relationship. We already knew that. That's nothing new. But what's new about that is in the electronic world, now the actors and the players in the relationship game change. Where they're at, when they're accessing, what they want to access. In many cases, do I need a consolidated medical record? Do I only need just the diagnostics information, and I don't really care who the patient is? This becomes a bigger challenge when we move into the electronic world. In the internet business models that we're familiar with as a consumer, consumer information gets sold all over the place. That's how Google and Amazon make their money. They don't make their money selling you a product. They make their money gathering data about how you behave and then reselling that to somebody else. Well, that breaks the trust model that we so value in the medical world. And so what happens is telecom service providers, those that provide the service, the network in between all of these entities, also have a role to play in that trust relationship of the data itself, as well as the relationship between the actors and the players involved in that health information. So what are some of the current issues we see about health records in the electronic world of e-health? And I'll just kind of highlight these. So as patient information is stored electronically, the scale of breaches increases. Okay? The likelihood of somebody breaking in and getting secure information increases. And obviously the problem with that is the value of that breakage is far higher than we experience in just the consumer world of like identity theft. And part of the problem there is that the patient has no recourse. Once the information is out, it's out. And the potential damage to the patient and the healthcare providers is immense. Bela kind of hit on this quite a bit. Okay, that healthcare providers are going to become overwhelmed by ICT and regulation complexity. I think you probably picked up on that, on some of the complexities of the evolution of the cloud piece of these kinds of environments. And then there's a whole wide variety of associations and industry organizations and standards bodies and technology forums involved in trying to solve pieces of these problems. That's a good thing, but it's also a challenging thing because that has created complexity. Because a lot of those activities are very isolated and only trying to solve one piece of all these complex problems. And without more interaction in that environment, the complexity is actually, there's going to be another layer of complexity there. I talked about kind of the increase in breaches as we move to an e-health environment. And just gives you some of the recent data from the U.S. government on breaches of medical information. And you can see a rapid increase, obviously directly tied to the adoption of e-health technology in the medical world. This kind of categorizes the types of breaches. I won't go through this a lot. The one that we hear most often about, theft. Somebody steals a PC, and the PC's got all these medical records on there with the patient's identification, their social security number, and all the diagnostics information, et cetera, all in a single record, and maybe thousands, if not millions of records on that PC. Still, that's the most common. So physical security is still paramount in the health industry. But as you look down that list, you'll see other types, hacking into the IT infrastructure. So on the rise as far as a breach opening into the e-health world. And that's going to continue to increase as we talk about, as Bella referred to, kind of this distribution of data, medical data everywhere, right? And more players want to interacting with that data, not from, for example, a physically secure location like a doctor's office. So in the past, historically, what we've been involved with, especially in the standards bodies I was referring to, have been kind of doing a very good job of defining security, privacy, et cetera, between highly trusted, well-established, closed communities of interest. So, for example, between the healthcare providers and those that have centralized repositories of the records that share that with very close partners. So, for example, some of the associations, you know, of providers that Bella referred to about, you know, kind of these close partnerships where the environment is fairly self-contained. I know who I'm interacting with. I know how to validate them and establish, kind of create kind of a firewalled environment around this closed community of players. But as we, and so some of the different standards activities, IEEE and Continuum Health Alliance are working more on the input side, where the data, the medical records and diagnostics data is gathered and aggregated by, for example, your local healthcare provider. So they're focused on the security and trust aspects of that portion of the ecosystem. And then other standards organizations like IHE and HL7 are focused on the sharing, you know, between the aggregators of that data, the ones that have that data in their central repositories, and how I have a trusted, secure relationship there. How do telecom providers play? Well, today, right now, they're just the transport of that data between this closed community of trusted, secure players and interacting organizations. But as we move to this kind of cloud environment that we've already heard about, a lot of that changes. So where the medical information is generated increases. Great example, okay? If I'm doing some kind of home healthcare environment, so I'm a hospital, somebody was treated at my hospital, now I send them home, they need to be remotely monitored for the next 30 days to decrease the chances of readmissions. So I send with them some monitoring or diagnostics instrumentation that's going to connect over the network. Well, now all of a sudden, significant medical information is generated in the home. It's aggregated in the home through possibly some kind of gateway and then sent over a broadband network, either wireless or wireline, back to a healthcare provider, or an insurance company, the hospital system, and then now that data becomes disaggregated and shared and distributed in the cloud, and now I have different players that want to interact with that information. A doctor who's not in their office, a doctor who's at home, or that's mobile, using an application on their tablet. And within this environment of where all the medical information is stored now, you want the ability to also segment the data and break it back apart. So, for example, if the doctor wants to refer to another physician, that physician really may not need to know the patient's identity. All they need to know is some of the diagnostics information. So the complexity increases between where all the inputs of the information, where it's stored, how it's distributed, how it's disaggregated again when it's shared, and all the different players that can interact with this system and access the kind of information they need, but only access the information they need and not additional information as well. So this is an area where we see really a lot of work needs to be done in standards activities and collaboration between industry associations to try to solve the complexities that we can move to this kind of cloud environment with multiple players, multiple sources of generating medical information. So there needs to be more collaboration between organizations that understand the telecom and ICT aspects of this kind of world, and those that understand the medical and the health implications and aspects of it. And I'm going to show you, actually, this is the kind of complexity we're seeing right now in that environment of trying to solve how are we going to exchange data, how are we going to secure it, what kind of standards are we going to follow, what kind of rules and policies and procedures are we going to follow. This gives you an idea of all the different players that are involved in trying to work on pieces of that complexity. Lauren briefly introduced ATIS at the beginning of the session. So they're coming at it from the ICT perspective of what can, especially service providers that provide networks and solutions, what can they do in this ecosystem to provide a trusted environment for the exchange of this information, for helping identify, okay, this physician is allowed to see this kind of information but not allowed to access this kind of information. And especially if you're now distributing that information in many different places, right? You have a bunch of activities that are involved more on the sensor side. You know, I have sensors that use Bluetooth or Zigbee or all sorts of different little short distance protocols that talk to a sensor that gather that data and then aggregate it in the home or aggregate it in the clinic. Some of it might be locally stored in the home or the clinic, and then some of it's shared back into the cloud and stored in a centralized or distributed way. So these are organizations that are all involved at that aspects of trying to solve some of these issues. Lauren mentioned 1M2M. I'll talk to that. I'll hit that now. So eHealth, the whole idea of I talked about that there will be, some forecasts show 50 billion connected devices to the internet in the next several years that humans don't interact with, right? And one of the major industries that will be part of that will be the health and medical communities, using those kinds of remote sensors and devices to gather information, whether it's in a clinic, a hospital, or in a home, an assisted living facility, et cetera. And so in the ICT industry, primarily driven by large service providers like Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom, NTT in Japan, AT&T and Verizon and Sprint in North America and the U.S., have realized that to try to create networking solutions to allow that connectivity and that sharing of information, it would make sense to create kind of one standard that would be useful for the healthcare industry to interact with, to get services from the network, to guarantee security, to guarantee a certain quality, to guarantee, for example, this data is very real-time oriented. So if I'm monitoring a patient remotely with some kind of imaging information or diagnostics information, monitoring cardiac information, for example, that's fairly sophisticated imaging information, analog waveforms, for example. And if I want to see that in real time, I expect the network to not delay that information. I want it very quickly. Whereas if it's already static information, for example, I took some very simple statistics on a patient, pulse, heart rate, temperature, et cetera, and then I create a fixed record, right? Well, that fixed record was maybe created an hour ago. And whether I get that to a provider in 30 seconds or a minute probably doesn't change the outcome, right? So healthcare providers need to be able to interact with the network and say, this kind of information I need in real time, whereas this information can be sent with a little bit of delay and it's not critical to my business. So 1M2M is focused on basically creating an environment where healthcare providers can interact with the network and say, this is the kind of service I need from your network. Including, for example, how to identify somebody that's accessing the network and saying they're allowed to have this information and go access this database, but not this one. So that's the focus of that organization. And then obviously in the healthcare world, you have a whole plethora of different organizations working on different aspects of e-health and solving different pieces of the solution for security and trust, especially as we're focused on that topic in this panel session. One of those is the SIF Framework. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but they have working on data segmentation for privacy. So how do you basically allow the ability to segment medical data and decide who gets what piece of that data? So instead of always having a centralized single record that has all of the information in it, the patient's identity, the diagnostics information, the healthcare provider, now I want to be able to break that apart and intelligently share pieces of that with people that are allowed to have access to only certain pieces. So they're focused on working on kind of the software environment of how to do that. And how, using web technology that's very well understood in the software development world, how do I use those web technologies, but then overlay privacy and security and do this segmentation? So where does that leave us as we talk about the whole concept of securing e-health records in the cloud? Well, probably you've picked up on is neither Bella nor I are going to stand up in here and tell you this is exactly how to do it, because we don't know yet. And I would say the industry as a whole doesn't know yet, right? We see the vision of where we need to get to, both in the cloud environment as well as in kind of this environment of many more players interacting and generating medical information, interacting with it, allowing that information to be segmented. So we know where we need to move to, but the steps that we need to go through to get there is still an evolving situation. And so here's some, I'm not going to read all these, but here's some of the kind of the big issues that we see. Scaling of cloud-based content. and access control, all right, against all the different individuals and players that would be allowed to access that. Is the cloud viewed as an interconnected host data center? Or does it also include, does it also include the devices out at the edge that are actually generating the data and may have some of that data stored locally? Is that part of the cloud? And if so, then how do you manage that, given all the input and the comments that Bella made about how you're managing a cloud, how you interact between clouds? Now, if the cloud extends to everybody's home, or every small clinic or doc in a box, or every clinic in a Walmart, the complexity increases, and some of the ways we do workflow and processes, and especially how we secure and authorize access to that information becomes important. What becomes the biggest points of vulnerability? It's probably no longer that a PC gets stolen. The points of vulnerability change. For example, the employees of a company that are now mobile, have tablets or smartphones with some kind of e-health application on their smartphone. Now that becomes a point of vulnerability. And if we drill down in more detail, we talk about, detailed records, but what about even basic things like fitness and wellness and nutrition, preventative care? How does that play in this environment? Is that a totally separate thing that we don't worry about securing as much? Most healthcare providers need to have a collaborative system that leads with these kinds of solutions on the front end and then deals with, what we talk about, telemedicine, telehealth, and clinical provision and hospital provision in the real business form. And then on the back end, when the patient leaves and is at home, how do I do remote monitoring and continue that health care? And then cycle them back in to more of a front-end preventative care. So all of this kind of process needs to be thought about. Lots of questions, and I think what we're saying basically here is the evolution of e-health environment, both in the cloud and as well as especially securing that kind of information, the privacy and security aspects, is an evolving process. And as you in kind of the medical industry need to be seeking out companies that have the expertise on how to go through those stages of evolution to migrate to this kind of environment that can help you do that. And ask a lot of good questions and raise the kind of concerns you have. Probably some of them have been reflected in these questions here. To how do we evolve into this kind of environment and still assure these kinds of criteria and challenges are met? So I think with that we can stop and go to questions. And I'll sit down here with Bella and we'll just handle questions from the floor.
Fresenius Medical Care. I think one underlying issue is that it's not clear who owns my health data, and it compounds as, the hospital gives me a sensor to take home. Do I control that? I've had very little visibility into it. At this time, if we were to come up with a paradigm that says that the patient owns everything about their information, then we might build applications, for example, where the patient could do more validation on their own, be more involved. It just doesn't go straight from a sensor. But again, I think that that's an underlying issue for governance.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that will also change from state to state and from country to country. Many countries in Europe, for example, the patient owns their data. Whereas here, it's almost a crapshoot, isn't it? So, you're absolutely right. And as usual, technology outpaces regulation
Policy, yeah.
and policy. So how that evolves, I think we'll need to see. There is also the other issue of, technology outpacing privacy rules and HIPAA rules. I showed that example of, if I held up my iPad and showed the other doctor. Well, and that's compounded by technology. It used to be, you know, if a doctor wanted to take some patient records home, stick it in his briefcase, you know, took it home at night to look it over and maybe showed his wife or something, you're already breaking rules. Now imagine, you know, to David's point, that a lot of this data is sitting on a laptop or an iPad, you know. So unfortunately, that will remain the case, that technology will outstrip policy, and we're going to have to find those models about how we secure data regardless of who owns it, you know, until policy catches up. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the last point was the key, is for this industry until policy catches up. The focus should be, how do we secure, keep that information private in a closed community until the regulatory bodies do start to sort that out. Because it's the reality is.
Everybody needs to see it.
Yeah, right.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions? Okay.
Great. Thank you
Good.
very
Well,
much.
thank you very much. Appreciate your time.